At this point, we're going to be privileged to have a little reflection on Justice Jackson. John provided us with a little introduction, provided us with the fact that Abby Mann had used parts of the opening statement. The opening statement occurred November 21st, 1945 at Nuremberg, which will be celebrated soon by many in trip at which we're going to Nuremberg. Similarly, the closing statement was July 26, 1946. Those are the bookends of major speeches by Justice Robert H. Jackson, the opening and closing statement. And we're going to be blessed at this point to have a few snippets from that, and I'll let Paul introduce our actor.
Thank you. As Greg has announced, for the final segment of tonight's program, we will be focused fully on the words of Robert H. Jackson. And for this purpose, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. James Ivey. Jim is a native Texan who has degrees from the University of Kansas, University of Illinois, and Texas Tech University, where he received his PhD in theater. Since 2000, Jim has been chair of the Department of Theater and Dance at SUNY Fredonia. Jim has many directing and acting credits, and his most recent one was right here. In August 2005, he appeared in the Chautauqua Opera Company's musical of The Music Man. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you my colleague and friend, Jim Ivey, who will be reading to you excerpts from Justice Robert H. Jackson's opening and closing statements from the first Nuremberg trial. Please join me in welcoming Jim Ivey.
May it please your honors. The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. This tribunal, while it is novel and experimental, is not the product of abstract speculations, nor is it created to vindicate legalistic theories. This inquest presents the practical effort of four of the most mighty of nations, with the support of 17 more, to utilize international law to meet the greatest menace of our time: aggressive war. The common sense of mankind demands that law shall not stop with the punishment of petty crimes by little people. It must also reach men who possess themselves of great power and make deliberate and concerted use of it to set in motion evils which leave no home in the world untouched. In the prisoner's dock sit 20-odd broken men, reproached by the humiliation of those they have led almost as bitterly as by the desolation of those they have attacked. Their personal capacity for evil is forever past. It is hard now to perceive in these men as captives the power by which the Nazi leaders they once dominated much of the world and terrified most of it. Merely as individuals, their fate is of little consequence to the world. What makes this inquest significant is that these prisoners represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatreds, of terrorism and violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power. They are symbols of fierce nationalisms and of militarism, of intrigue and war-making, which have embroiled Europe generation after generation, crushing its manhood, destroying its homes, and impoverishing its life. They have so identified themselves with the philosophies they conceived and with the forces they directed that any tenderness to them is a victory and an encouragement to all the evils which are attached to their names. Civilization can afford no compromise with the social forces which would gain renewed strength if we deal ambiguously or indecisively with the men in whom those forces now precariously survive. Unfortunately, the nature of these crimes is such that both prosecution and judgment must be by victor nations over vanquished foes. The worldwide scope of the aggressions carried out by these men has left but few real neutrals. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. We must summon such detachment and intellectual integrity to our task that this trial will commend itself to posterity as fulfilling humanity's aspirations to do justice. At the very outset, let us dispose of the contention that to put these men to trial is to do them an injustice, entitling them to some special consideration. These defendants may be hard-pressed, but they are not ill-used. Let us see what alternative they would have to being tried. More than a majority of these prisoners surrendered to or were tracked down by the forces of the United States. Could they expect us to make American custody a shelter for our enemies against the just wrath of our allies? Did we spend American lives to capture them only to save them from punishment? If these defendants should succeed for any reason in escaping the condemnation of this tribunal, or if they obstruct or abort the trial, those who are American-held prisoners will be delivered to our continental allies. For these defendants, however, we have set up an international tribunal and have undertaken the burden of participating in a complicated effort to give them fair and dispassionate hearings. That is the best known protection to any man with a defense worthy of being heard. Mr. President, and members of the tribunal, it is impossible in summation to do more than outline with bold strokes the vitals of this trial's mad and melancholy record, which will live in as the historical text of the 20th century's shame and depravity. As a military tribunal, this tribunal is a continuation of the war effort of the Allied nations. As an international military tribunal, it rises above the provincial and transient and seeks guidance not only from international law, but also from the basic principles of jurisprudence, which are assumptions of civilization and which long have found embodiment in the codes of all nations. Of one thing we may be sure. The future will never have to ask with misgiving, what could the Nazis have said in their favor? History will know that whatever could be said, they were allowed to say. They have been given the kind of a trial which they, in their days of pomp and power, never gave to any man. But fairness is not weakness. The extraordinary fairness of these hearings is an attribute of our strength. The prosecution's case at its close seemed inherently unassailable because it rested so heavily on German documents of unquestioned authenticity. The fact is that the testimony of the defendants has removed any doubt of guilt which, because of the extraordinary nature and magnitude of these crimes, may have existed before they spoke. They have helped write their own judgment of condemnation. The strength of the case against these defendants under the conspiracy count, which it is the duty of the United States to argue, is in its simplicity. The prosecution submits that these premeditated crimes were not a separate and independent phenomena, but that all were committed pursuant to a common plan or conspiracy. The defense admits that these classes of crimes were committed, but denies that they are connected one with another as parts of a single program. The central crime in this pattern of crimes, the kingpin which holds them all together, is the plot for aggressive wars. The chief reason for international cognizance of these crimes lies in this fact. Have we established the plan or conspiracy to make aggressive war? Certain admitted or clearly proven facts help answer that question. First, is the fact that such a war of aggression did take place. Second, it is admitted that from the moment the Nazis came to power, every one of them and every one of the defendants worked like beavers to prepare for some war. The question therefore comes to this: were they preparing for the war which did occur, or were they preparing for some war which never has happened? The whole group of pre-war crimes, including the persecutions within Germany, fall into place around the plan for aggressive war like stones in a finely wrought mosaic. The activities of all these defendants, despite their varied backgrounds and talents, were joined with the efforts of other conspirators, not now in the dock, who played still other essential roles. They blend together into one consistent and militant pattern animated by a common objective: to reshape the map of Europe by force of arms. A glance over the dock will show that despite quarrels among themselves, each defendant played a part which fitted in with every other, and that all advanced the common plan. It contradicts experience that men of such diverse backgrounds and talents should so forward each other's aims by coincidence. The dominant fact, which stands out from all the thousands of pages of the record of this trial, is that the central crime of the whole group of Nazi crimes, the attack on the peace of the world, was clearly and deliberately planned. The beginning of these wars of aggression was not an unprepared and spontaneous springing to arms by a population excited by some current indignation. The same war purpose was dominant in the persecution of the Jews. The Nazis regarded the Jews as foremost among the opposition to the police state, with which they planned to put forward their plans of military aggression. Accordingly, they were transported like cattle to the concentration camps, where they were utilized as a source of forced labor for war purposes. Nor were the war crimes and the crimes against humanity unplanned, isolated, or spontaneous offenses. Aside from our undeniable evidence of their plotting, it is sufficient to ask whether 6 million people could be separated from the population of several nations on the basis of their blood and birth, could be destroyed, and their bodies disposed of, except that the operation fitted in to the general scheme of government. Could hundreds of concentration camps located throughout Germany, built to accommodate hundreds of thousands of victims, and each requiring labor and materials for construction, manpower to operate and supervise, and close gearing into the economy, could such efforts have been expended under German autocracy if they had not suited the plan? Has the Teutonic passion for organization suddenly become famous for its toleration of non-conforming activity? Each part of the plan fitted into every other. The slave labor program meshed with the needs of industry and agriculture, and these in turn synchronized with the military machine. The elaborate propaganda apparatus geared with the program to dominate the people and incite them to a war their sons would have to fight. The armament industries were fed by the concentration camps. The concentration camps were fed by the Gestapo. The Gestapo was fed by the spy system of the Nazi Party. Nothing was permitted under the Nazi iron rule that was not in accordance with the program. Everything of consequence that took place in this regimented society was but a manifestation of a premeditated and unfolding purpose to secure the Nazi state a place in the sun by casting all others into darkness. One of the chief reasons the defendants say there was no conspiracy is the argument that conspiracy was impossible with a dictator. The argument runs that they all had to obey Hitler's orders, which had the force of law in the German state, and hence obedience could not be made the basis of an original charge. What these men have overlooked is that Hitler's acts were their acts. It was these men among millions of others, and it was these men leading millions of others who built up Adolf Hitler and vested in his psychopathic personality not only innumerable lesser decisions, but the supreme issue of war or peace. They intoxicated him with power and adulation. They fed his hates and aroused his fears. They put a loaded gun in his eager hands. It was left to Hitler to pull the trigger, and when he did, they all at that time approved. His guilt stands admitted by some defendants reluctantly, by some vindictively, but his guilt is the guilt of the whole dock and every man in it. Each of these men made a real contribution to the Nazi plan. Each man had a key part. Deprive the Nazi regime of the functions performed by a Schacht, a Sauckel, a von Papen, or a Goering, and you have a different regime. Look down the rows of fallen men and picture them as the photographic and documentary evidence shows them to have been in their days of power. Is there one who did not substantially advance the conspiracy along its bloody path toward its bloody goal? In the testimony of each defendant, at some point there was reached the familiar blank wall. Nobody knew anything about what was going on. These men saw no evil, spoke none, and none was uttered in their presence. This claim might sound very plausible if made by one defendant, but when we put all their stories together, the impression which emerges of the Third Reich, which was to last 1,000 years, is ludicrous. The defendants have been unanimous when pressed in shifting the blame on other men, sometimes on one and sometimes on another. But the names they have repeatedly picked are Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, Goebbels, and Bormann. All of these are dead or missing. No matter how hard we have pressed the defendants on the stand, they have never pointed the finger at a living man as guilty. It is a temptation to ponder the wondrous workings of a fate which has left only the guilty dead and only the innocent alive. It is almost too remarkable. The chief villain on whom blame is placed by some of the defendants is Hitler. He is the man at whom nearly every defendant has pointed an accusing finger. I shall not dissent from this consensus, nor do I deny that all these dead and missing men shared the guilt. In crimes so reprehensible that degrees of guilt have lost their significance, they may have played the most evil parts. But their guilt cannot exculpate the defendants. Hitler did not carry all responsibility to the grave with him. All the guilt is not wrapped in Himmler's shroud. It was these dead men whom these living men chose to be their partners in this great conspiratorial brotherhood. And the crimes that they did together, they must pay for, one by one. It is against such a background that these defendants now ask this tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing, or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. They stand before the record of this trial as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the window as they beg of you, "Say I slew him not." And the queen replied, "Then say they were not slain, but dead they are." If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, there are no slain, and there has been no crime.